My daughter stopped calling me dad after I remarried now. I know. Why? People often say that the loudest cry is the one that never leaves your throat. And I learned this truth the hard way when I realized my daughter hadn't just stopped speaking to me. She had stopped seeing me entirely. Hey everyone, before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Arthur, and I am 55 years old. For a long time, I believed that love was a zero-sum game, that there was only so much of it to go around, and that once a person was gone, the love you held for them had to be redirected, or it would simply fade away. When my wife, Susan, passed away after a brief and aggressive illness, I felt like a house that had been gutted by a fire. The structure was still standing for walls, a roof, a mortgage butt, the warmth, the light, and the purpose had been extinguished. I was left alone with our daughter, Isabella, who was only 12 years old at the time. We were two survivors wandering through the wreckage of our shared life, trying to navigate a world that suddenly felt gray and indifferent. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping us moving, by plastering over the cracks in our foundation and trying to rebuild. But I failed to see that Isabella wasn't ready to rebuild. She was still living in the ashes, and in my haste to find solid ground again, I left her behind. It took 3 years for me to feel like I could breathe again without the air catching in my throat. During that time, I threw myself into my work and into being a father, but I was operating on autopilot. I fed Isabella, clothed her, drove her to school, and attended her parent-teacher conferences, but I didn't truly see her. I was looking through her, haunted by the ghost of the woman who used to sit at our dinner table. When I met Brenda, it wasn't because I was looking for a replacement for Susan. It was because she made me feel like a man rather than a widower. She laughed easily. She cooked meals that actually had flavor. And she didn't look at me with the constant pitying concern that everyone else in my life did. She represented a future that didn't smell like antiseptic and funeral flowers. I fell in love with the possibility of happiness again. And in my selfishness, I assumed that Isabella would eventually want the same thing. Brenda and I dated for 18 months before I decided to propose. It was a quiet affair, intimate and hopeful. But when I sat Isabella down to tell her the news, her reaction wasn't the anger I had steeled myself for. It was far worse. It was a terrifying, absolute silence. She looked at the ring on my finger, then up at my face, and her eyes, so much like her mother's, went completely blank. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, and she didn't beg me not to do it. She just stood up, walked back to her room, and closed the door. I interpreted that silence as acceptance. I told myself she was a mature 15-year-old who understood that her dad needed a companion. I told myself she was happy that I was happy. I lied to myself with the expertise of a man who was terrified of facing the truth. And I walked down the aisle 6 months later with a smile on my face, oblivious to the fact that I was signing away the relationship I had with the only other person who loved Susan as much as I did. The wedding itself was a beautiful, understated affair in a garden. Surrounded by friends and the new family Brenda brought into my life, Isabella served as a bridesmaid, a role she accepted without complaint. She stood at the altar wearing a dress that matched the color scheme, holding a bouquet of lilies, and she smiled for the photos. But looking back at the pictures now, I can see the tightness around her eyes. The way she held her body rigid, as if she were physically preventing herself from falling apart. I missed every single signal. I missed the way her hand trembled when she placed it in mine for the father-daughter dance. I missed the way she excused herself the moment the cake was cut. I was too high on the adrenaline of my new beginning to notice that my daughter was experiencing her own ending. As I drove away with Brenda to start our honeymoon, I glanced back at the house where Isabella was waiting for her aunt to pick her up. I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know then that the weight of that lightness would eventually crush my daughter. The transition from a single-parent household to a blended one is rarely seamless. But in our case, it felt less like a blending and more like an erasure. Within weeks of the wedding, Brenda moved into the house that Susan and I had bought together. She brought with her furniture, curtains, and a scent of vanilla and lavender that slowly replaced the smell of dust and old books that had permeated the house since Susan's death. Brenda was well-meaning, eager to establish herself as a maternal figure, and she tried hard to connect with Isabella. She redecorated the living room, rearranged the kitchen cabinets, and subtly began to phase out the reminders of the life that existed before her. She wasn't being malicious. She was simply making space for herself in a home that was still fully occupied by the memory of a dead woman. But to Isabella, who was navigating the treacherous waters of mid-adolescence, these changes must have felt like an assault. The first tangible shift occurred at the dinner table. For years, even after Susan died, we had kept a ritual of eating together at the big oak table in the dining room. It was a way to maintain a sense of family. But Brenda preferred the breakfast nook, and so, slowly, we moved our meals there. The big table sat silent, a museum piece gathering dust in the corner. It was a small change, but it signaled the end of the old hierarchy. Brenda began to cook meals she was familiar with, meals that Susan never would have made. She filled the silence with chatter about her day, asking Isabella questions about school, her friends, and her hobbies. Isabella's responses were monosyllabic. A nod, a shake of the head, a barely audible fine. I mistook this brevity for typical teenage moodiness. I would laugh, nudge Isabella, and tell her to give her stepmother a chance. Every time I did that, every time I took Brenda's side, I didn't realize I was drawing a line in the sand. I was telling Isabella that her discomfort didn't matter, that her grief was inconvenient to my new happiness. Then came the change in how she addressed me. It happened gradually. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find the two of them eating breakfast. Isabella looked up, asked if I could pass the milk, and called me Arthur. It stung a sharp pinch in my chest, but I laughed it off. I told myself she was trying to be adult, maybe mimicking something she heard on television. But she never went back to Dad. Over the course of that first year, the name vanished from her vocabulary entirely. It was replaced with silence or indirect references. She stopped talking to me and started talking at me, communicating only when necessary regarding logistics or chores. I responded by pulling away as well, convincing myself that I was giving her space. I spent my evenings in the living room with Brenda, watching movies and talking about our plans for the future, while Isabella retreated further into her bedroom, becoming a ghost in her own home. The physical distance grew right alongside the emotional distance. Isabella began spending all her time at the library or at friends' houses. She would come home long after dinner, eat a plate of leftovers in silence, and disappear again. I stopped asking where she was going. I stopped asking who she was with. I told myself she was independent, that she was resilient. I prided myself on raising a self-sufficient young woman. In reality, I was abandoning her. I was trading the difficult, messy work of comforting a grieving child for the easy, comfortable joy of a new marriage. I saw her withdrawal as an act of rebellion against me, specifically against my remarriage. I interpreted her silence as a weapon she was using to punish me for moving on. I resented her for it. There were nights when I lay in bed next to my new wife, seething with frustration that my daughter couldn't just be happy for us. I didn't understand that her silence wasn't a weapon. It was a wall she was building to protect herself from the pain of being replaced, brick by painful brick. I remember one specific afternoon about 6 months after the wedding. Isabella was 16, and it was a Saturday. I was in the backyard grilling steaks with Brenda, enjoying the sunshine and a cold beer. Isabella came out, dressed in black, her hair dyed a dark shade that matched her mood. She announced she was going to the cemetery. I froze. I hadn't visited Susan's grave in over a year. It was too painful to final, and I had convinced myself that Susan lived on in our hearts, not in a plot of land. I looked at Isabella and told her that she shouldn't dwell on the past, that she should focus on living her life. I told her to go to the mall or the movies instead. Brenda chimed in, suggesting a shopping trip for the three of us. Isabella looked at me with an expression of utter betrayal. It was the first time I saw a crack in her armor, a glimpse of the raw pain underneath. But instead of stepping toward her, I stepped back. I turned my attention to the grill. She turned around and walked out the front door. She didn't go to the cemetery. She didn't come back until after midnight. That was the day she stopped looking at me as a father. From that moment on, I was just the man who lived in the house with the woman who took her mother's place. High school is a turbulent time for any teenager. But for Isabella, It became a fortress she constructed to keep me out. She accelerated academically, throwing herself into her studies with a ferocious intensity that should have alarmed me. Instead, I bragged to my colleagues and Brenda about how driven she was. I took credit for her focus, claiming that my emphasis on personal responsibility was paying off. I didn't see the loneliness behind the strata report cards. I didn't notice that she never brought friends over. I didn't see that she was eating lunch alone or skipping school events. I was too busy playing the role of the happily married man, hosting dinner parties and weekend barbecues. Isabella became a prop in my narrative, the successful stepdaughter who proved that blended families could work. I paraded her achievements while ignoring the hollowness in her eyes. The absence of her mother became a physical void in the house that I tried to fill with material things. If Isabella got an A, I bought her a new laptop. If she made the honor roll, I upgraded her phone. I thought I was rewarding her. In hindsight, I was trying to buy her forgiveness. I was trying to pay off the guilt I felt every time I looked at her and saw Susan's face. But Isabella didn't want things. She wanted her mother, and by extension, she wanted the father she had before the grief turned me into a stranger. She returned every gift with a polite, detached nod. She never used the new camera I bought her for photography. She never wore the locket I gave her for her 17th birthday. The items sat in her room, pristine and untouched, like museum exhibits of a father's failed attempts at connection. By the time she was a senior, the dynamic in the house had solidified into a cold coexistence. Brenda had given up trying to bond with her, settling instead for a polite truce. They interacted like roommates who barely knew each other, passing in the hallway with mumbled greetings. I acted as the buffer, the bridge between two shores that were drifting further apart into the ocean. I mediated disputes that were trivial, misunderstandings that were actually symptoms of a much deeper rupture. I remember a fight they had over the laundry. Isabella had left a black sweater in the dryer, and Brenda had washed it with whites, turning it pink. It was a stupid, mundane accident. But Isabella's reaction was disproportionate. She screamed. She threw the sweater against the wall. She accused Brenda of trying to erase everything that was hers. I stepped in, as I always did, and scolded Isabella for being ungrateful and dramatic. I told her it was just a sweater, that Brenda didn't do it on purpose, and that she needed to apologize. Isabella stared at me, her chest heaving, and for a second I thought she was going to hit me. Instead, she just stopped. The fight drained out of her instantly, leaving her looking exhausted and old. She picked up the ruined sweater, walked to her room, and closed the door. She didn't come out for 2 days. She skipped school, and I let her. I didn't go in and check on her. I didn't bring her food. I left her there, stewing in her anger and her sorrow, convinced that she just needed to cool off. I didn't realize that I had just confirmed her worst fear, that I would always choose Brenda's comfort over Isabella's pain. I was telling her that the pink sweater didn't matter, but the symbolism was crushing. Her stepmother could ruin her things, and I would defend the stepmother. Her feelings were collateral damage in my pursuit of domestic bliss. Graduation day was supposed to be a celebration. I sat in the auditorium, Brenda beside me, beaming as Isabella walked across the stage. She looked beautiful, but she looked tired. She didn't look out into the crowd for us. She accepted her diploma, shook the principal's hand, and walked off the stage without a smile. After the ceremony, we stood in the crowded hallway waiting for her. When she finally appeared, cap in hand, I stepped forward to hug her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her how proud I was. She flinched. It was a subtle movement, a barely perceptible shrinking away, but it stopped me cold. My hands hovered in the air for a moment before I awkwardly patted her shoulder. She stepped back, putting distance between us. She said she needed to go to a party with friends. I asked which friends, where the party was, when she would be home. She looked at me with a flat, dead gaze and simply said, "Don't wait up." Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of celebrating families, leaving me standing there with my wife and a bouquet of roses that she would never see. The summer after graduation was the beginning of the end. Isabella turned 18 in July, and we had a small party for her at the house. She invited a few people I didn't know, and they stayed in the backyard, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly amongst themselves. She moved through the party like a ghost, accepting the card I gave her and the check inside it without even opening it. A few weeks later, she announced that she had been accepted to a university on the other side of the country. It was a prestigious school, but it was also 2,000 miles away. I was stunned. I had assumed she would go to the state college, maybe live at home for a while, or at least stay within driving distance. When I asked her why, she just shrugged and said she wanted a fresh start. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that she was running away, that she was being impulsive, but Brenda squeezed my hand and whispered that we should let her spread her wings. So, I nodded. I signed the check for the tuition deposit. I helped her pack her bags. Moving her into the dorms was a surreal experience. The drive across the country was mostly silent. She listened to music with her headphones on, staring out the window at the passing landscape. I tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks, bringing up memories from road trips we used to take with Susan. She didn't respond. She just watched the world go by, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the hum of the tires on the asphalt. When we arrived at the university, I carried her boxes up 3 flights of stairs, sweating and panting, trying to make small talk with her new roommate, a bubbly girl who looked at Isabella with wide, curious eyes. Once everything was moved in, I stood in the middle of the cramped dorm room, feeling a lump in my throat. I was losing her. Not just to college, but to something I couldn't name. I reached out to hug her goodbye. I told her I loved her and that I was just a phone call away. For a split second, she'd let me hold her. She felt stiff, unyielding, like a plank of wood. She didn't hug me back. She pulled away, looked me in the eye and said, "Have a good life, Arthur." She didn't say, "I'll call you." She didn't say, "I love you." She didn't say, "Dad." She dismissed me. She turned her back on me and started organizing her desk, effectively ending the conversation. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish and heartbroken, before walking out to the car. Brenda was waiting, smiling sympathetically. I got in, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I was too proud to look back. I was too proud to admit that I was driving away from the most important person in my life. And I was leaving her there, alone in a strange city, because I was too cowardly to face the mess I had made. For the first few months, she barely called. When she did, the conversations were stilted and brief. She would answer my questions about her classes with one word, then pivot to asking about Brenda, the house, the dog. It wasn't because she cared about those things. It was a tactic. She wanted to keep the conversation superficial. She wanted to keep me at arm's length. I stopped calling as much. I told myself she was busy, that she was having the time of her life. Brenda and I settled into a routine. We redecorated the house, turning Isabella's bedroom into a guest room almost immediately after she left. I packed away her trophies, her posters, and her childhood books into boxes and shoved them into the attic. I was erasing her physical presence from the house, just as I had erased her emotional presence from my life. I thought I was moving forward. I didn't realize I was systematically destroying every trace of the family I once had. Years passed. Isabella finished her undergraduate degree and stayed on the West Coast for graduate school. She visited home maybe twice a year, usually for major holidays. These visits were awkward performances. She would arrive with gifts, polite and smiling, acting like a distant cousin rather than a daughter. She would sit at the dinner table and listen to Brenda and me talk about our lives, our vacations, and our renovations. She rarely shared anything about her own life. If I asked about her job or her relationships, she would give vague, non-committal answers. She was a stranger I shared DNA with, and yet I convinced myself this was normal. I saw my friends dealing with their own adult children drifting away, and I used that as a benchmark. I told myself this was what modern parenthood looked like. I ignored the ache in my chest that grew deeper every time she walked out the front door. I ignored the fact that she never hugged me hello or goodbye. I ignored the silence that filled the room whenever she entered it. I got very good at ignoring things. The revelation came on a rainy Tuesday evening, 5 years after Isabella had moved away. She had come home for a rare visit. Her 26th birthday was approaching, and she had agreed to spend the weekend with us. I was thrilled. I had planned a nice dinner, cooked her favorite meal, and even bought a bottle of expensive wine to celebrate. but the evening started off rocky. She seemed distant, even more so than usual. She picked at her food and barely spoke. After dinner, she claimed she had a headache and needed to take a walk. I offered to go with her, but she refused sharply. So, I stayed inside, helping Brenda clear the table, nursing a glass of wine, and feeling the familiar sting of rejection. I went into the den to read, leaving Brenda in the living room to watch television. About 20 minutes later, the rain started pouring down. I realized Isabella hadn't taken an umbrella. I grabbed my coat and headed out, thinking I would be the doting father and meet her halfway, maybe drive her back so she wouldn't get soaked. I walked down the street, scanning the sidewalks. I didn't see her. I assumed she had sought shelter in the small park a few blocks away. As I approached the park, I saw a figure sitting on a bench under the gazebo. I slowed my pace, smiling, ready to call out her name. But just as I opened my mouth, I heard another voice. A man's voice. Isabella wasn't alone. I stepped behind a large oak tree, not wanting to intrude on what seemed like a private moment. I assumed she was on the phone with a friend or perhaps a boyfriend I didn't know about. But as I listened, I realized she was sitting next to someone. I peered around the trunk and saw a young man sitting beside her, holding an umbrella over both of them. They were close. I felt a surge of curiosity mixed with fatherly protectiveness. I stayed hidden, listening to the low murmur of their conversation. I just wanted to know who this guy was. I wanted to know if she was happy. But what I heard shattered the world I had built for myself. The young man, whose name I later learned was Lucas, was speaking softly to her. He was pleading with her, his voice thick with emotion. He was asking her why she wouldn't let him meet her parents. He told her that after 2 years of dating, he deserved to know where she came from. Isabella's response was a cold, hard laugh that sent a chill down my spine. She told him there was no point. She told him that the people in that house weren't her parents, at least not anymore. She said that her father died a long time ago, and the man living in that house was just a replacement. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wanted to rush out there, to demand she explain herself, to tell her how much that hurt. But my feet were rooted to the spot. I was paralyzed by the realization that this was the truth she had been hiding from me. Lucas pushed her, asking what she meant. He told her that Arthur was her father, that he was right there in the house. Isabella's voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I heard raw, unfiltered emotion. She told him that when her mother died, Arthur didn't just lose a wife, he lost his capacity to be a father. She explained that she thought he was grieving too, that they were a team until the day he brought Brenda home. She told Lucas that she didn't hate Brenda. In fact, she pitied her. She said that her father hadn't just replaced her mother. He'd replaced his entire life, including his daughter. He wanted a do-over, a fresh start with a new wife and a new dynamic, and Isabella was the loose end he had to tie up. She said he traded us in. He traded the grief of a widow for the comfort of a new marriage, and the price was me. He didn't want a daughter who reminded him of his dead wife. He wanted a clean slate, so he got one. I slumped against the rough bark of the tree, the breath knocked out of me. The rain soaked through my coat, but I couldn't feel the cold. All I could feel was the crushing weight of her words. Lucas tried to comfort her, telling her that couldn't be true, that he must love her. But Isabella shook her head. She said, "You don't get it. He doesn't see me. He sees a problem he solved. He thinks I'm just dramatic and jealous. But I'm not jealous of Brenda. I'm sad for her. Because she thinks she has a husband, but really, she just has a man who runs away from his pain. And I'm sad for me, because I realized a long time ago that I was mourned right alongside my mother. I was just too slow to realize I was already dead to him. I didn't confront her that night. I couldn't. I stood in the rain, hidden behind that tree, until Isabella and Lucas stood up to leave. They walked in the opposite direction, heading toward the downtown area. I walked back to the house in a daze, dripping wet and shivering. Brenda was in the hallway, looking concerned. She asked me where I had been, where Isabella was. I looked at my wife, the woman I thought had saved me, the woman I had chosen to build a life within. I didn't recognize her either. I brushed past her, mumbled something about Isabella staying out, and locked myself in my study. For hours, I sat in the dark, replaying Isabella's words in my head. I tried to deny them. I tried to tell myself she was wrong, that she was being overly dramatic, that she didn't understand the complexities of adult grief. But the more I tried to argue, the more the truth of her statements settled in. I thought back to the wedding day, to the look on her face. I thought back to the dinner table arguments, the closed doors, the Arthur instead of Dad. I had interpreted all of it as a rebellion against my happiness. I had framed her pain as an inconvenience to my life. I had treated her grief as a phase she needed to get over, while I was allowed to move on, to remarry, to start over. The realization that hit me hardest was her accusation that I had traded them in. I had never thought of it that way. I thought I was surviving. But from her perspective, standing on the outside looking in, it must have looked exactly like a trade. I swapped the memories of Susan for the comfort of Brenda. I swapped the messy, difficult reality of raising a grieving daughter for the easy companionship of a new wife. Every time I told Isabella to give Brenda a chance, I was really saying, "Your feelings are less important than my new relationship." Every time I bought her a gift instead of listening to her, I was paying her off to keep quiet. I wasn't a father to her. I was a manager of her emotions, trying to minimize the damage she caused to my new life. The next morning, Isabella came home for breakfast. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed, but her face was a mask of indifference. She assumed I knew nothing of the conversation in the park. She sat down, poured herself a coffee, and stared at the table. I watched her, seeing her in a completely new light. I didn't see a rebellious teenager or a distant adult. I saw a little girl who had lost her mother, and then, effectively, lost her father too. I saw someone who had been screaming for help in silence for over a decade, and I had simply turned up the volume on the television. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the table. I wanted to beg for forgiveness, to fall on my knees and plead with her to tell me how to fix it, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you apologize for 10 years of neglect? How do you ask for a second chance when you've already wasted the first one? I tried to speak. I stammered out a greeting, asked her how she slept. She gave me a curt nod, her usual response. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a father and daughter who don't need words. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of two people who no longer know how to talk to each other. Brenda came in, bustling and cheerful, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring under the roof. She chatted about brunch plans, looking at Isabella expectantly. Isabella just shook her head and said she had to leave soon to catch her flight. The finality in her voice was like a guillotine blade dropping. She wasn't just leaving for the weekend. She was leaving for good. I knew that if I let her walk out that door without saying something, without acknowledging the truth, I would lose her forever. But I was terrified. I was terrified that she would reject me, that she would confirm what she said in the park, that I was already dead to her. So, I sat there, paralyzed by my own cowardice, watching her finish her coffee. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and looked at me. For a second, our eyes met. I saw a flicker of something in her gaze, maybe a plea for me to finally understand, maybe just a final goodbye. I opened my mouth, my heart pounding, desperate to bridge the chasm I had dug, but she looked away first. She turned to Brenda, thanked her for the stay, and walked out the front door. I listened to the sound of her suitcase wheels rolling down the driveway, and then the silence of the house rushed back in. Louder than ever before. It has been 6 months since that rainy Tuesday, and the silence in my house has changed. Before it was a silence I could ignore, a background noise to my life with Brenda. Now it is a constant, piercing accusation. I am 55 years old. I am finally learning that emotional neglect is a wound that doesn't bleed, but it never heals. Isabella went back to the West Coast, and I have not seen her since. She stopped answering my texts. She stopped taking my calls. Her mailbox is full. I sent her a letter a month ago, a long, rambling confession where I poured out everything I overheard, everything I realized, and how deeply sorry I am. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted her to know that I finally understand. I don't know if she'll read it. I don't know if she burned it. I haven't received a reply. Brenda has noticed the change in me. She sees the way I stare at Isabella's empty chair at dinner. She sees the way I wander into the guest room, the room that used to be hers, and just stand there. We talk about it now, late at night, in the dark. It is painful, but it is necessary. I have had to tell Brenda the truth, that in choosing her, I sacrificed my daughter. I told her that while I love her, the way I went about it was cruel and selfish. Brenda's devastated, but she is also angry at herself for not seeing it sooner. We are living in the wreckage of my choices, trying to figure out if there is anything left to salvage. We go to therapy. I go alone too. I am trying to dismantle the ego that allowed me to believe that my happiness was more important than my child's well-being. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a parent. I used to think it meant providing a roof, food, and education. I thought if I wasn't abusive, I was doing a good job. But I know now that parenting is about witnessing. It is about seeing your child even when they are difficult, even when they are broken, and especially when they remind you of the things you are trying to forget. Isabella wasn't jealous of Brenda. She was mourning the loss of the sanctuary our family used to be. When I brought Brenda into that sanctuary without first ensuring Isabella felt safe, I violated her trust. I made her feel like a guest in her own grief. I made her feel like she had to compete for my love. And the worst part is, she stopped playing because she knew she couldn't win against a man who had already decided to move on. I don't know if Isabella will ever come back. I don't know if she will ever call me dad again. The realization I had in the park didn't fix anything. It just broke me in a new way. It forced me to look in the mirror and see the man who abandoned his daughter in plain sight. I tell this story not because I want pity, but because I want other parents to hear me. When your child pulls away, when they stop calling you mom or dad, when they look at you with blank eyes, don't just assume it's a phase. Don't just assume they are being dramatic. Look at them. Really look at them. Ask yourself what you are placing above their pain. Ask yourself if you are replacing the past instead of integrating it. I live every day now with the hope that maybe one day Isabella will find it in her heart to let me back in. Not as the father who knows best, but as the man who is finally trying to listen. But I also accept that this might be the price I pay. I spent a decade running from my grief, and I ran right over the heart of the only person who shared it with me. If I never speak to her again, I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the forgiveness I haven't earned. I will spend the rest of my days knowing that the silence she gave me wasn't empty. It was full of all the words I was too deaf to hear. And that is a confession I have to carry alone, in the quiet of the house that used to be a home.